Imagine you're standing in medieval Europe and someone tells you they've invented a weapon that doesn't require years of training to use effectively. A weapon that doesn't care about your strength, your height, or your natural athleticism. A weapon that could pierce through armor that took a blacksmith weeks to forge. You'd think they were insane, right? Well, buckle up, because the story of how guns were actually invented is way wilder than you'd expect, and it involves more chaos and unexpected twists than you might possibly imagine. Before we dive into the chaos, if you like learning about the weird, the wonderful, and the downright explosive history of human ingenuity, hit that subscribe button. We're about to explore one of the most world-changing inventions in human history, and trust me, it's got more twists and turns than you'd think. Let's rewind about 1,000 years. We're in China, probably somewhere around the 9th century, and the Chinese have just figured out something remarkable. They've combined three things that seem totally unrelated: saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur. These three ingredients, when mixed together, create something spectacular. They explode. Not like your chemistry class volcano spectacular, but actually useful, world-altering spectacular. This is gunpowder, and it's about to change literally everything about human civilization. Now, here's the thing nobody tells you. The Chinese didn't invent gunpowder because they were thinking about warfare. They invented it for fireworks, for celebrations, for making pretty lights in the sky during festivals and important occasions. Some monk or scholar just happened to mess around with these minerals and went, "Whoa, that's cool." History's greatest military innovations sometimes start as party supplies. Think about that. The earliest military applications of gunpowder in China weren't actually guns. They were fire lances, fire arrows, and hand cannons that were basically just metal tubes strapped to sticks. These things were so unstable and so dangerous to the person using them that soldiers would often refuse to carry them. Imagine being a warrior in the 1200s and your commander hands you this metal tube and goes, "Yeah, this might explode in your hands, but it might also scare the horses." That's a tough sell, but the Chinese military kept experimenting. They realized that if you could contain an explosion in a metal tube and point it at your enemy, you had something really special. The first actual gun, a primitive cannon called the hand cannon, showed up around the mid-13th century. Picture this thing. It's basically a hollow metal tube, maybe a foot long, attached to a wooden handle. You stuff gunpowder in it, jam a projectile on top, and then you take a lit fuse and touch it to a hole in the back. If everything goes right, the projectile flies out. If everything goes wrong, well, you're not using that hand anymore. These weapons were so unreliable that they were about as useful as a sword during a rainstorm. Gunpowder doesn't work great when it's wet. See, you had to keep it dry, keep the match burning, and somehow keep your cool while operating something that could explode at any moment. Meanwhile, your enemy is walking toward you with a crossbow that never fails and a sword that's always ready. Your gun needs a solid minute to reload, if you're lucky, and your hands aren't shaking uncontrollably. So why did guns stick around? Why didn't they just abandon this technology and go back to tried and true methods of stabbing and shooting things the old-fashioned way? Because somebody realized something crucial. With a gun, you didn't need to be a swordmaster. You didn't need years of training. You needed to point and shoot. An untrained peasant with 2 weeks of gun training could kill a knight who spent his entire life learning sword techniques. That changed everything about warfare. It changed everything about power. This is where the story gets interesting for real. Once Europe got wind of what China was doing, they became absolutely obsessed. By the 1400s, every European power wanted guns. Lots of guns. This kicked off a technological arms race that lasted centuries. Armies started recruiting soldiers differently. It wasn't about finding the strongest guys or the most agile guys. It was about finding enough guys who could be trained to load, aim, and fire a musket in under 2 minutes. The problem was early. Muskets were terrible. They were slow, they were heavy, they required a match cord to fire, and half the time they didn't fire at all. Soldiers would march into battle with these things and find themselves defenseless while reloading. This is actually why you see those old paintings of armies arranged in weird square formations. Soldiers in the front rank would fire and then step back to reload. While they were reloading, the rank behind them would step up and fire. Then those guys would step back. It was like a coordinated dance of death, but it worked surprisingly well. Europe kept iterating. Somebody invented the flintlock mechanism, which was huge. Instead of a burning match cord, you had a piece of flint that would strike a steel plate and create a spark. Suddenly your gun didn't need constant supervision. It was safer, faster, and more reliable. This wasn't some gradual improvement either. When flintlocks became standard, they absolutely transformed military tactics. Armies could operate faster, soldiers could carry more ammunition, battles could be won or lost in minutes instead of hours. Here's something they don't teach you in school. Guns didn't actually end medieval warfare because they were inherently superior in every way. They ended it because they were democratic. Any kingdom with enough resources could equip a bunch of farmers with muskets and give them 2 weeks of training. You didn't need to breed a warrior class, you didn't need a feudal system, you just needed access to iron, saltpeter, and coal. That's revolutionary. The ripple effects were absolutely bonkers. Suddenly, fortification design had to change completely. Those big, tall castle walls, useless against cannon fire, military engineers had to invent a completely new way to design fortifications that could withstand artillery. The Star Fort was born, this weird geometric defensive structure that looks like it was designed by someone who was really obsessed with angles and geometry. And it worked. These forts could withstand cannon bombardment way better than traditional castles. But the real kicker is what happened to global power dynamics. Whoever had the best guns and the best manufacturing infrastructure started dominating everyone else. Europe got really good at making guns. Better than anyone else, actually. By the 1500s and 1600s, European powers were sailing around the world with superior firepower, and it changed history forever. This isn't some simplification. Guns literally made European colonization possible. Small groups of European soldiers could conquer much larger armies because those armies were using traditional weapons against people with firearms. Now, there's something important we need to acknowledge here. The invention of guns was transformational technology, but like all transformational technologies, it came with a massive downside. It enabled colonization. It enabled slavery trades. It enabled the subjugation of people who had no defense against superior firepower. Technology itself is neutral, but the applications of technology are not. Guns could have been used to unite the world or to exploit it. History shows us which path was chosen, unfortunately. Let's talk about the actual technical evolution because it's kind of amazing and complex. We've got hand cannons, then muskets, then rifles with rifling, then percussion caps, then the mini ball, which was this awesome innovation that made rifled muskets actually practical and effective. Each of these represented a leap forward in lethality and efficiency. By the time we get to the 1800s, weapons technology had advanced so far that battles became bloodbaths in ways that previous generations couldn't have imagined. The American Civil War was really the first modern war, and it was horrifying. Suddenly you had armies equipped with rifled muskets, artillery that actually worked reliably, and tactics that hadn't caught up to the technology. Generals were still trying to fight battles like it was the Napoleonic Wars, but their soldiers had weapons that made cavalry charges suicidal. Tens of thousands of casualties in single battles. The technology had evolved faster than military strategy could adapt. But let's back up and talk about the technical specifications of early guns because they're actually kind of interesting. A hand cannon, like I mentioned, was super simple: tube, handle, touch hole for the fuse. The challenge was keeping the barrel from exploding, which actually did happen sometimes. You're trying to contain an explosion that's pushing way more force than you'd anticipate, and metallurgy in the 1200s wasn't exactly advanced. So you had to make the barrel really thick, which made the gun really heavy, which made it really hard to aim, which made it really unreliable. It took like 100 years of iteration just to make cannons reliable enough to use in war without a constant risk of them exploding and killing your own soldiers. This is important context. Technology doesn't just appear perfect. It starts as barely functional prototypes, and then people spend generations figuring out how to make it work. Muskets improved the hand cannon design significantly. They started using matchlock mechanisms where a lit match was held in a spring-loaded clamp that would push it into a pan of powder. When you pulled the trigger, the clamp would snap down, the match would hit the powder, and if you were lucky, the powder would ignite and set off the main charge. Unlucky, the match goes out, or the powder is too wet, or the match has burned past the spark point, or 1,000 other things go wrong. The matchlock was replaced by the wheel lock, which was more reliable but way more complicated and expensive to produce. Then came the flintlock, which was actually reliable, much simpler, and way more that dominated the world for over 100 years. Flintlocks armed the soldiers of the Napoleonic Wars. Flintlocks were what European colonizers used to conquer the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Flintlock muskets are what made the British Empire actually possible. What's wild is that flintlock technology is actually really elegant once you understand it. You pull the trigger, which releases a spring that's been holding back a hammer with a piece of flint attached to it. The hammer snaps forward at high speed and hits a hardened steel surface called the frizzen. This creates sparks that fly into a pan of fine gunpowder beneath the frizzen. That powder ignites, creating a flame that travels down a channel into the barrel where your main charge is waiting. The whole sequence takes less than a second. Here's what's interesting. Flintlock technology, from invention to reliable mass production, took like 50 years. That's actually pretty fast for weapon technology. But it still took a long time for most armies to adopt it. Armies are conservative institutions. They don't like change. Soldiers are comfortable with what they know, so you'd have armies coexisting with different weapon systems for decades, some guys still using matchlocks while other guys have flintlocks. It's inefficient, but it's how technology actually spreads through institutions. The percussion cap, invented in the early 1800s, was the next big innovation. Instead of flint and steel and open pans of gunpowder, you had this little metal cap filled with a sensitive compound that would explode when struck. You could make guns faster, more reliable, and waterproof. The percussion cap made guns competitive with bows for the first time, not just in terms of firepower, but in terms of speed and reliability. An archer could still shoot faster than a musketeer could reload, but the musketeer's shots were way more powerful and didn't need years of training to master. Then, rifles with rifling came along and messed everything up again. Rifling is just spiral grooves inside the barrel that make the bullet spin. Spinning bullets fly straighter and faster and more predictably than smooth-bored bullets. Military commanders realized this meant soldiers could actually hit what they were aiming at from further away. Suddenly, the effective range of infantry weapons doubled or tripled. This completely changed how battles worked and how armies positioned themselves. The rifle musket, the mini ball ammunition, and percussion caps together created this perfect storm of improvement. By the time of the American Civil War, soldiers had weapons that were fast, reliable, and accurate at ranges that would have been impossible 50 years earlier. This is why the Civil War was so bloody. Generals were still using Napoleonic tactics where you'd march in tight formations and charge at enemies. But enemies with rifles could cut down a charging formation from hundreds of yards away. Thousands died in futile charges that should never have happened if generals had adapted their tactics to their weapons. Let's talk about non-European gun development because there's this persistent myth that guns were just a European thing. They weren't. The Ottoman Empire had some amazing gun makers. Japan eventually mastered firearms technology, though interestingly, they temporarily stopped using them for cultural reasons. India had gun manufacturers. The Middle East had gun makers. Gun technology spread around the world, and while Europeans might have gotten there first, they definitely weren't the only ones who figured it out. What did matter was production capacity. By the 1700s, Europe had industrial capacity that was unmatched anywhere else in the world. Not because Europeans were smarter, but because they had invested heavily in things like water mills and manufacturing techniques that could be scaled up. A European nation could equip an army of 50,000 soldiers with rifles way faster than any other power on Earth. This industrial advantage was way more important than the invention of any specific weapon. This brings us to the really weird philosophical question. When you ask, how were guns invented? What you're really asking is a much bigger question about technological development. Did one person invent guns? No. It was thousands of people making small improvements over centuries. Did China invent guns? Well, they invented gunpowder and the first-hand cannons, but they didn't invent the musket or the rifle. Did Europe invent guns? They definitely figured out how to mass-produce them and use them effectively, but they didn't invent them from scratch. The truth is more complicated and more interesting. Guns were invented by humanity as a whole, gradually over 1,000 years, with contributions from multiple civilizations, multiple cultures, and countless individuals whose names we'll never know. Some monk in China mixed chemicals and discovered an explosion. A blacksmith somewhere figured out how to cast a stronger tube. An engineer realized how to make a better firing mechanism. An industrialist figured out how to make firearms in quantity. All of these things together led to guns. And here's the thing that keeps me up at night. We can't uninvent guns. We can't go back to a world without them. Even if every gun on Earth was destroyed tomorrow, people would start making new ones. The knowledge exists. The resources exist. You could build a functional gun from basic materials if you knew how. That's what makes gun technology so important to understand. It's not going anywhere. It's never going away. And understanding where it came from, how it developed, and what impact it's had is crucial to understanding the modern world. Guns made the modern world. They ended feudalism by making traditional warrior classes obsolete. They enabled European colonization. They made nation-states possible because suddenly you could equip citizens with weapons. And they didn't need to be hereditary warriors. They changed the entire power structure of the world. For better or for worse, and honestly, it's mostly worse for most of the world's populations, but that's what happened. The last thing I want to touch on is the continuing evolution of firearms. Guns didn't stop improving in the 1800s. They kept getting better. Breech-loading rifles replaced muzzle loaders. Metallic cartridges became standard. Repeating rifles came along and changed everything again. The lever-action rifle, the bolt-action rifle, the semi-automatic rifle, and eventually the automatic rifle. Each iteration made soldiers more dangerous and warfare more efficient at ending lives. The really interesting development is the magazine-fed rifle. Once you have a rifle that loads ammunition from a magazine instead of one round at a time, you've fundamentally changed warfare. Soldiers can maintain fire while reloading. Rate of fire increases dramatically. The lethality of small arms skyrockets. By World War I, rifles had reached a point where they were almost as lethal as they would ever be. World War II didn't really improve the rifle much, but it did perfect everything around the rifle. Tactics, logistics, manufacturing, organization. All of that reached a peak. Modern rifles are basically the end point of this evolution. We could make them better, but the improvements would be marginal. A modern battle rifle isn't that much more effective than a rifle from 1945. The real innovations have been in areas like optics, ammunition, ergonomics, and manufacturing tolerance. The core technology, the basic operation of point, aim, shoot, hasn't changed. We've just gotten really, really good at it. This is actually interesting philosophically. We reached a kind of technological plateau with rifles. We can't really make them more effective at killing people. We can make them more accurate, more reliable, more comfortable to shoot, but the fundamental lethality has plateaued. We hit a ceiling. That's not true for other weapon systems, though. Jet fighters are way better than they were in 1945. Missiles are way better, artillery is way better, but the basic rifle, the foot soldier's weapon, we kind of maxed that out. What's wild is that the most effective soldiers today are often just riflemen with good training, good equipment, and good tactics. You add a few specializations like sniper rifles or grenade launchers, but the basic toolkit hasn't changed that much since the 1940s. A soldier from 1944 would actually recognize and understand most of the weapons used by soldiers today. The terminology is different, the materials are better, the ergonomics are improved, but the operation is essentially the same. So where does that leave us? Guns were invented in China, improved by Arabs and Europeans, perfected by Victorians, and refined by everyone since. They transformed the world. They ended an entire social system, enabled colonization, enabled industry, and they're still the most important weapon on any battlefield. 100,000 soldiers with rifles is still more effective than 5 billion soldiers without them. That's the reality of the world we live in. The invention of guns was one of the most important moments in human history. Not because guns are inherently good or bad, but because they fundamentally changed what was possible in warfare and civilization. They changed power structures, they changed tactics, they changed strategy, they changed which nations could be superpowers and which couldn't. They changed everything about how we organized ourselves and how we interacted with each other. And it all started with a monk in China mixing saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur, probably not thinking about warfare at all. Just thinking about making a cool explosion that would impress people at festivals and celebrations. That's how world-changing technologies usually happen. Someone accidentally discovers something amazing, and then we spend the next 1,000 years figuring out how to weaponize it and perfect it beyond recognition. If this video made you think about the wild history hidden in everyday things, or if you want more videos about how stuff was actually invented and how it shaped the world we live in today, hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment telling me what invention you think would be cool to explore next. And thanks for watching. That's all for now.